Long ago the clock washed midnight away, bringing the dawn. Oh God, I must be dreaming. Time to get up again and time to start up again. Pulling on my socks now. Where did the night go?
All right, welcome everybody warmly to Platform Labour and the End of Sleep. My name's Lo Marshall. I'm a research fellow working with Ben Campkin as part of the London NITE team. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting today this fantastic panel of speakers with my colleague from the Berlin team, Laura-Solmaz Litschel. Each of our panelists, Valentin Niebler, Barbara Orth, Winifred and Nick Dunn, will be speaking for 15 minutes each. And then we've got time for questions and discussion afterwards. So if you've got a question for our speakers, like with the other sessions, please write them in the chat and we'll get to them after the talks.
Hello also from my side. Today we want to look at new different forms of so-called digitalized labor and the impact they have on the city NITE and its workers. Online platforms in particular play a certain role here. In recent years, online platforms have become central infrastructures of our everyday lives. The 24/7 gig economy exacerbates existing inequalities and perpetuates them. The question we will approach in this panel is if, and if yes, to what extent, these forms of labor lead to a loss of the night and perhaps even to an end of sleep for certain groups in our societies, if we want to follow Jonathan Crarey's dystopic vision of our future cities. The first talk that we will hear today is held by Valentin Niebler, and Valentin is a dear colleague of mine who works with me at the Institute for Migration Studies at Humboldt-Universität. Valentin studied social science at Humboldt-Universität Berlin, New School in New York, and the University of Würzburg. He's a member of the Center for Emancipatory Technology Research. The project Valentin is recently working on is called Platform Labor in Urban Spaces, and it investigates the impact of the expansion of digital platforms on urban working and living conditions. Valentin's talk today has the title Stretching the Limits, Platform Labor and the Politics of Temporality. Thank you very much for being here, Valentin, and you can now share your screen.
Thanks for the introduction. I hope the screen share works. Can you see everything? I hope so. I just hope so.
Yes.
So, yeah, thanks again also from my side for the invitation. As Laura already said, I will be speaking today about some research that I and colleagues have done in Berlin in the last years for the Project Plus, Platform Labor in Urban Spaces, which looks at 4 platforms, Uber, Airbnb, Helpling, and Deliveroo, in 7 European cities, so it's relatively big. And what I present today are just some really early findings, more empirical than conceptual. Mostly the findings really from Berlin that we did ourselves here. And yeah, I also have to say that the research has not been specifically geared towards the NITE, but I hope it's still helpful to answer some of the questions posed on the conference. I also could unfortunately not join so far, so can't pick up any issues, but I still hope it's informative. Yes, so I thought maybe to begin with, because this panel is about platforms specifically, I might talk a bit about platform labor itself. Sorry for the ugly slide. I think it will become better in the next slides. So to introduce the issue, I will quickly sketch out what platform labor actually is or means. Platform labor describes working arrangements that are facilitated by digital intermediaries, usually structured as marketplaces between customers and workers. Labor on these platforms is usually characterized by 2 main aspects. On the one side, the self-employment of workers, which makes them usually responsible for social security, and the risk of low demand are the risks too. And secondly, the often tight digital control of these workers through forms of so-called algorithmic management. For instance, the location tracking of drivers, or automatic sanctions for bad customer ratings. Platform labor, this is so to say the topic of my talk today, comes along with a strong promise of flexibility. You might, that's what the companies say, you might start when you want, stop when you want. Often there are no strict shifts. So with this Uber advertisement in Berlin, for instance, says you can drive with the Uber app day or night, fit driving around your life, not the other way around. That's a very interesting claim that we'll sort of look at closer in the next 10 minutes. So while there are surely more and many reasons to join and to stay in a platform work arrangement, for workers, the promise of flexibility is why many workers actually enter these jobs, according to our interviews, and often really in the hope to combine it with other work or activities. Or other duties. It's interesting, however, that at a closer look, this perceived flexibility is somewhat limited or not even present at all, or even worsens for the workers, especially those who whose main earning comes from this job, but also workers who do it part-time are struggling with this issue of perceived flexibility. I will illustrate this issue with examples from income earners on the platform Uber and Airbnb in Berlin, and hope to contribute how platforms may contribute or not to an end of sleep, or at least to its severe disturbance or fragmentation. And I will start off with Uber. Situation of Uber in Berlin. As you may know, Uber is a taxi service that operates worldwide since around 10 years. Although in Berlin, the business model works a bit different due to the regulation of the taxi sector. Conditions are still relatively typical for platform work. So drivers can choose when they start and end their work technically, but they're also responsible for their earnings. So if not enough customers appear, and there are a lot of workers sort of thrown on the market, there's no cap. If not enough customers appear, they are not paid appropriately and risk unpaid waiting time. So they just stand around and don't get paid. And while drivers are usually free to work anytime they want, the times worth driving are usually very specific, and they are supported, these specific times are supported through bonus programs by the company. Uber often subsidizes if drivers work during the nights specifically and on weekends. So even though there are no official times, there are sort of implicit working times enforced through payment schemes. And the fact that these stable work shifts don't exist for most Uber drivers also means that the workday of drivers is often highly fragmented, you could say. So they drive day and night with times for rest only really in between. There's no clear distinction. And I want to illustrate this by a quote from one of our interviewees, a 29-year-old driver that I interviewed last year just after COVID-19 hit. At the time he had stopped driving, but he told me a bit about the experience of his last year because he was really, sort of fed up with the work and really exhausted. And so he describes a usual week start like this. He says, I got up on Mondays at 4 or 5 until 1 o'clock. Then I got home, ate, slept, because you're tired, because you got up early, because after a while it drags on. Then you take a nap, 1 or 2 hours, then you get up because you're hungry, you put on clothes, and you get going right away again, because now it's the rush hour business after 4 p.m. There's lots to do. So you start driving at 4 until 12, 1 o'clock in the night, and then the same procedure all over. Which I found a pretty strong quote. I mean, he's talking more or less about kind of a 14, 15, maybe 16-hour day. That's pretty incredible, and really only sleeps in between. Right, and especially if drivers are highly dependent on their job, they practically, sometimes really more or less live in the car, often 6 days a week. And so really this promise of flexible working time actually is reverted into its opposite and is transformed into a demand for permanent availability. My second example is Airbnb. And due to time reasons, I will keep it a bit shorter. Airbnb, as you probably know, is a company that offers short-term rentals through a platform. Rentals are offered by so-called hosts who are not part of the company. And even though they are not part of the company, the platform sanctions hosts if they are not responsive to customers. Their responsiveness is measured through a reply rate on their Airbnb profile, and then they can be sanctioned by customers also with bad ratings. And of course, this is not so much an issue for occasional hosts, people who rent out their home one time a year, but it's definitely an issue for hosts who have, for instance, to sublet a room through Airbnb to even afford rent. So there's very different situations for hosts, and the ones who are in a precarious situation really suffer from this aspect. Since customers or guests can be in need of information or help anytime, of course, they are new to the place, they don't know the place, the host's duty is often to be available almost constantly. Again, a quote, one of our interviewers describes this pressure for availability as a constant, he says, mental effort. He explains this mental effort like this. He says, by mental effort, I mean that there is someone who might need to contact you. You have to be somehow reachable. If a person needs something urgently and you feel quite responsible for giving them an answer almost in real time. So yes, the idea is that you must be available, that you have to communicate. And this is really all in the context of Airbnb pressuring through messages and through the score to ensure quick answers. So this constant availability, which comes along with an often immense amount of affective and emotional labor, so they have to be there, they have to be friendly, even if it's 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe. It's not just necessary to do this sort of work for on-site guests, but it's also very important to respond online just to requests by anyone, which, by the way, made it easy for us also to contact them for interviews because they usually had to reply through Airbnb. And when we asked these hosts for their working times, they could often not clearly say how much they work. So it usually was hard to say for them how much this availability time counted as work for them. However, many said they underestimated the work involved for guest availability and that it often also stretched into late night times. Obviously, this has to be said, working on Airbnb is often not, so the work on Airbnb is often not the main aspect of the rental business. Sometimes earnings are more connected to the value of the property itself. However, for the work itself, if we look at the work, which is an enforced reality for a lot of hosts, these platform-based politics of temporality are at play. Looking at these two examples, what can be really learned from them? I think what can be learned from these two examples is that platform companies, they play with this promise of a new working time regime, high flexibility and autonomy through the coordination of digital technology. Somehow through digital technology, we can all work flexible. However, unless you're really a well-secured part-timer or a well-off house owner, the usually low precarious pay on these platforms enforces a highly fragmented, intensified workday. So instead of more autonomy, it actually kind of ties workers even closer to their labor than they thought. Generally, workers appear to be involved in a regime that would be sort of the conceptual part now, that researchers Julie Chen and Ping Sun have coined temporal arbitrage, temporal regime that firstly normalizes customer expectations for timed and monitored fulfillment. So customers just expect to be served at all times through these platforms. And thereby secondly leads workers to perform duties in a pragmatic and fragmented manner. And this is informed by the platform's policies. What is interesting for research, besides these observations, I think, is also how, can't go too much into detail into this, but how workers manage and negotiate these demands and how they find loopholes to still remain autonomy. So one possibility, for instance, is the sharing of accounts informally, or tricks to cheat the bonus schemes at Uber, so to gain more money by tricking bonus schemes. Overall, it has to be said that this regime is also really hostile to disadvantaged groups, such as like female drivers who face risks when working at night, or towards people with care duties who can't do these care duties, fulfill these care duties when they have to work all the time. However, especially marginalized workers still enter these jobs because there is often no alternative, or because other working arrangements are even more demanding, precarious, and inflexible. So I think this also has to be considered. To finally conclude, I would add that the observations shared here are surely not entirely new. I would not state that. Many of these dynamics have existed before. If we look in the taxi sector, they have existed to some extent. In the hospitality sector, they have existed to some extent too. But I would argue that really the limits and boundaries of what is acceptable are severely stretched. And precarity is, especially in this first case of Uber, accelerated. Our findings point, of course, not to an end of sleep. The workers still sleep. But I would say to a severe fragmentation in many cases, and an extension of the working day to practically 24-hour availability. That was my talk. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this brilliant insight in the working realities of gig workers. The second talk that we have today is held by Barbara Orth and called Care for a Gig Job, Research Strategies for Investigating Reproductive Labor in the Platform Economy. And Barbara Orth holds a bachelor's in international relations from the University of East Anglia and a master's in refugee and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford. Barbara is a research associate and PhD candidate at the Department of Geography at Free University Berlin. Prior to joining Free University, Barbara conducted research on career support structures in Berlin's labor market and labor market access for refugees and asylum seekers. Last week, Barbara and I met each other, let's say, more or less virtually, as the poster presentations have been pre-recorded in these strange pandemic times at a conference about platform labor at Cambridge University. I had there the chance to see a great poster presentation by Barbara about care gig work. And so I'm very, very happy to have her here at our conference today and to hear her speak about that topic again from a more or less nocturnal perspective. Thanks for being here, Barbara. I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will share my slides. Let me know if you can see them. Can you see the slides? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara, as Laura just told you. And my talk today presents my ongoing doctoral work on digital care platforms. Contrary to Valentin, my talk is actually more conceptual than empirical because I'm just starting out on my field work. So I'm just sharing with you some of my thoughts, and I'd be very happy to hear what you have to say and discuss it with you. I find this topic of care platforms particularly interesting because it sits at the intersection of migration regime theorizing, feminist thinking about the nature of reproductive labor, as well as science and technology studies and urban studies. We just heard from Valentin about the challenges of gig work, the need to constantly be available, the way that work is stretching out across the night. And the stretching out of hyper-precarious labor, unpaid and underpaid, is the starting point of my talk about the digitization of reproductive labor. So, as I'm sure most of you know, the conceptualization of care and domestic work as reproductive labor rather than productive labor goes back to the materialist feminists such as Silvia Federici and campaigns such as Wages for Housework. The term illustrates that every worker who is a worker by day, whether gig worker or not, has to reproduce their labor power overnight. So the night I understand here as after working hours, after productive working hours. And this is a time when groceries are bought, when meals are prepared, when clothes are bought, washed and ironed, when apartments are tidied and cleaned, and when children are fed and being nurtured. So from a feminist materialist perspective, night work is really nothing new, and stretching out the workday to a second shift, as Ali Hochschild would remind us, is really already a reality for those socialized as women. To just give you a brief example, in Germany, women take on about 52% more care and domestic work than people socialized as men. The undervaluing of care and domestic work has been a really hotly debated issue since the pandemic started. But of course, the feminist movement has been talking about this for, I would say, decades, if not centuries. And interestingly, the part that technology plays in that is that early feminist activists, sort of like around the turn of the last century, still assumed that technology really was the key to liberating women from their yoke in the home. And they thought that once you automated laundry and, maybe cooking or collectivized, that everything would be fine. Well, of course, we know we've had vacuum cleaners and, dishwashers and laundry machines for at least 6 decades now. And of course, that hasn't really helped that much with the unfair distribution of reproductive labor. So, how is this technology interesting in digital terms? Well, in industrialized countries, we have a growing population of people requiring care, a trend that's, of course, likely to become even more pronounced with an aging demographic. And at the same time, we have more and more women who are unwilling to perform this role of unpaid caregiver as an act of love, quote unquote. And so from the 1980s onwards, we see a trend where scholars have theorized global care chains in migration studies. So that is the outsourcing of reproductive labor to women from the global south by more affluent women in the global north. I would argue some of the literature now talks about global care chains 2.0, and that is that telecommunication platforms such as Zoom, but also Skype and all the others, they really facilitate an uber exploitation of these already fairly exploited women, because now they can keep in touch with their communities back home and stay abroad for even longer than they used to. A second set of literature talks about care robots and the sort of automation of care, which of course is very difficult. So I just wanted to mention that. But my focus, of course, is on gigified reproductive labor. And I think that, again, is a topic that's received, unfortunately, not that much attention in academia yet. I think a lot of people are starting to work on it now, but private investors, as well as nonprofits and governments, are really investing a lot in that sector. So the National Health Service in the UK, for example, is partnering with developers to digitize various aspects of care, including developing staff models that work with the lean platform model that Valentin just spoke about, and that has already been discussed quite widely in the literature. So what is a care platform? What do I mean by that? I use care and domestic work a little bit interchangeably in this talk. Of course, there are nuanced debates about these terms, but we can maybe talk about that more in the Q&A. So when I say care platforms, what I mean is digital labor platforms that offer household-related services in general. So that could include babysitting, but also cooking or cleaning services, and also what I would call light nursing services. So that's stuff that falls short of licensed nursing, but is still relevant for people who require care at home. So that could be grocery shopping, watering plants, simply keeping an elderly person company, or watching a child do their homework. So as I briefly alluded to, even though care platforms are so important, they've sort of fallen through the cracks a bit in between different disciplinary boundaries, I think. Researchers who work on domestic work, especially live in domestic work and global care chains, are not really paying that much attention to digitization. And platform research has been predominantly on, Airbnb, but also ride-hailing and food delivery. And these are, of course, industries that are quite male-dominated and also spatially quite visible in cities, whereas domestic work obviously takes place in the home, so it's less visible to researchers. I think care platforms and other types of gig platforms share important features, but they're also quite different. One way in which they're different is they're starting from a very different place, I would argue. So Valentin just mentioned Airbnb and Uber as examples where platforms really strive on breaking down unionized workforces, for example, taxi unions, but also the hospitality sector that has certain standards that Airbnb obviously doesn't adhere to. And care platforms start from the opposite end. So care is a very informalized sector. Domestic workers struggle to unionize. There's a lot of effort, but it's very hard to unionize domestic workers because they're so spatially dispersed. And it's a very unorganized workforce. As you can probably imagine, if you're a nanny, you're unlikely to have a job contract. A lot of this work is illegalized, so it's done by undocumented people, but also by people who are sort of semi-documented. So they might be legally in the country, but they might not be allowed to work as much as they do. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, whereas ride-hailing and food delivery is really dominated by men, often men of color and migrant men, care work really is overwhelmingly done by migrant women and women of color. And I think that changes in terms of what happens, as Valentin just said, when you barely have time to sleep as a gig worker, and then does someone actually, have food for you at home? Does someone actually make your bed? Does someone actually take care of you when you get home? Care platforms sort of share the review and rating systems that Valentin already alluded to. So one-sided reviews, right, where a customer can rate a nanny, for example, but not the other way around. And they also use a sort of algorithmic management and rating techniques that other gig platforms use. And similarly to Uber, they punish workers who fail to keep up perfect ratings. And I would argue in terms of care work, that's even harder because you're really trying to build a profile. As you can probably imagine, you don't, as a customer, you want your child or your, granny or whoever you're trying to take care of, you want them to be with a trustworthy person. So these reviews and ratings take on an even more pronounced role on these platforms. And the platforms have a highly visual design. So care platforms almost look like regular social media profiles, and some platform apps you can actually swipe on workers. So it kind of looks a bit like Tinder for domestic work. And this visual design really requires a lot of emotional labor. I mean, Valentin already mentioned that Airbnb hosts have to be really quick to respond and really friendly. And that is also very much true for care platforms, where there's really this emphasis on personality. What kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person we want our child to spend time with? Are you the kind of person who just really likes spending time with an elderly person? And Ali Hochschild, for example, would call this deep acting. So the kind of service work on top of service work that really makes the service work doable. yeah, and so overall, getting a gig just requires a lot of emotional labor. And I think in that sense, then Gigified care and domestic work is different from traditional care and domestic work, even though traditionally care and domestic work is already very precarious. But you have this these bad interaction. If you have a bad interaction on a care platform, it can really lead to long-term issues. Whereas if you say fall out with a parent that you've met informally through an informal network, and they badmouth you, that might not impact you in the long run, because you can find someone else. You can maybe go through different routes, different connections, pick up nannying or babysitting work through other networks, and then that bad interaction is not really set in stone. Whereas on an app, it kind of is set in stone, or it's a high cost to get rid of it. Because of this trust feature and the rating, your personal info may be compromised. So care platforms require you to really put yourself out there, and they encourage their users, so the customers, to also search for workers online. So many platforms really encourage you to share your social media links. And so a worker is not just the person on the profile, but even more than that. So with all of this, in short, I would argue that care platforms really combine some of the worst features of live-in domestic works, this constant availability, constant surveillance, with the worst features of doing this work as a live-out domestic worker, which means that you have more autonomy, but you also have to pay for living expenses, which in a big city, of course, can take a huge part of your earnings. So in short, I think there's more research that is needed to understand these things better, because we really know very little about this. And this is what I'm trying to do in my doctoral project. And I just want to now show you some of the questions that I'm working on, and we'll close with that. So research gaps. What I'm particularly interested in is, do care platforms amplify existing inequalities? So for example, what kind of digital fluency does it take to be on this platform? So are people excluded because of age? Then with the visual aspects, is lookism and racism an issue? Do men, for example, find it harder to get care work gigs because of the sort of gendered assumption that customers have? And how does this work feel compared to analog work in the sector? So do people really feel the surveillance is different, or would they argue that actually, I don't really mind, the surveillance is already bad in domestic work, so whether an app does it or if someone's looking over my shoulder, I don't actually care. And then lastly, that goes also, or relates also to what Valentin said in terms of the strategies workers can employ to make a living off of these platforms. So with a highly visual profile, it becomes harder to share your account. And so the question is then, who can afford to uphold these ratings on a platform without being able to share an account? It's really just you who has to put the work in, and if you get sick, there's no one else to cover for you. So I think it's quite different from ride-hailing and food delivery in that sense. And I think that's sort of what I can say in the time that I've been allocated. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to discussing these thoughts. Feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter if you want to discuss it further after this talk. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk, and honestly not something that I'd given very much thought with. I'm really struck by those similarities with Valentin's talk and thinking about Uber and Airbnb, but also the real particularities of this context of care work and someone, the kind of continuality, the continualities with the kind of gendered, classed and racialized dynamics of care work and the way it's been feminized and undervalued in terms of labor, but also the particular scrutiny and disciplinary function of the platforms is quite terrifying, frankly. It's really fascinating. And also just the way that through these platforms, and this is perhaps obvious and speaks to me, this not really being my area of expertise, but I'm struck by the way those dynamics of men being in public and women being working within a domestic sphere that really link back to those kind of separate sphere ideologies that we talk about in gender studies, are really manifest within these platforms. Thank you so much. It's given us plenty to think about. I'd like to welcome Winifred now. Hi, Winifred.
Hi.
So Winifred Poster is a sociologist with a PhD from Stanford University. She teaches at Washington University in St. Louis and has recently held visiting positions in universities in India, Sweden, Germany, Canada, and the Intel Science and Technology Center for Social Computing at UC Irvine. Her interests are in digital globalization, feminist labor theory, and Indian outsourcing. And under several grants from the National Science Foundation, Winifred has been following information and communication technology industries in the US and India, which she's going to speak to about us today. How are we going? We've got some slides to share.
Yes, so I'll share my screen. Hopefully this will work.
Wonderful. Over to you.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so it's been such a pleasure to attend several of the sessions of this conference on...
Sorry, may I interrupt you? We still see the speaker.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the sessions. Several of them had really interesting accounts of nighttime work in global north cities, in hospitality, culture, and entertainment, sort of things that we might think of as nighttime work. I would like to present what nighttime work looks like in the global south, specifically in India, because I think it presents a very different kind of what would be nighttime work. In fact, the character of this work is often what we might consider to be daytime work in other contexts. So office work, jobs in information, communication, technology, and services. And not only are they like these daytime jobs, but they are also literally jobs from the global north. They are jobs that are sent, via the internet and information technologies to India, which I'll talk about, through outsourcing. So they're literally global north jobs themselves. And so I want to talk a little bit about how this industry is developed and what this means for workers who are in them. So from a global south perspective, the nighttime city is not just a sort of section or category of the day. It's actually a political artifact of colonialism and post-colonialism. And I have some theorists on the screen here who've been thinking about these things. Barbara Adam talks about colonialism by temporal means or colonization with time, to note how time was an element of how colonialism was practiced in places like India. And even today, Aditya Nigam talks about disjunction of temporal experience, so that the time of the global belongs in some sense to the powerful. And you can see this disjuncture in the outsourced industries, the outsourcing industry of India. Outsourcing is basically an industry of back office work, the stuff that happens behind the scenes for global north companies that want to find cheap resources for it. So it's like data entry, software development, and also call centers, which is something that I've personally been interested in because this is work that is done interactively over the phone. It's helping customers with their needs. And so it has to be done in sync. So this is done largely for the global north, for the US and the UK in India's case, because this workforce is English speaking and cheaper. They're paid about 1/10 sometimes of the wages of similar workers at global north firms. It also reflects not only labor arbitrage, but temporal arbitrage, as Valentin was mentioning earlier. And it has created an industry that operates almost entirely at night because it has to be done on consumer time in the US, which is 12 hours flipped from India. And this was an industry that was actively promoted by the state. So here's a publication that came out from one of the states in India where the IT sector was developed. And as you can see, it has if you can tell, there's a picture of a tractor there on farmland that represents the old industry of India, and they want to move into the IT-driven economy, which the picture is literally at night. So nighttime is the time of the future of the IT industry. And you can see the visible impact of how they've achieved this in the landscape of areas around New Delhi, in South Delhi and Gurgaon, where I did a lot of my research. It used to be all farmland, and now it has literally a cyber city. They call it high-tech city, cyber city. You can see here, this is Microsoft right on this corner. But it also has transformed other parts of the city. Now there are big shopping malls that all operate at night as well, somewhat to serve this, nighttime workforce. And you can see it on the roads. And here you can see these are shuttles. This is a view outside of one of the call centers I was at. The shuttles line up at night to transport the workers to and from, because this is actually a state provision mandating that workers be conveyed at corporate cost. So then you can see there's a flooding of the streets there with these little call center minivans. And it's not just, that doesn't just happen at one time in the beginning of the night and then another time at the end of the night. It happens continuously all night because the call centers are set up to constantly receive the workforces for every time zone that opens up, in the US and the UK. Every time there's a consumer base that's waking up, they want a labor force that's sitting in the chair ready to talk to them. So there are many kinds of, impacts on workers for being in this industry. They are making above average wages for the local context. And they're benefiting from the nighttime city in terms of this elevated infrastructure and housing that they specifically get. But there are costs of living entirely at night. And this has to do, first of all, with the dissonance from the daytime economy. So they can't, these workers see their own families. They have disrupted sleep and eating schedules. Many of them were sick. They described to me, I interviewed these workers, many kinds of physical ailments. They can't even go to the doctor because those doctors only open the daytime. They can't do chores in the markets. They can't prepare for marriage and go on dates. They can't even go on interviews to find a new job because their schedule is completely switched. And to me, the really interesting thing or notable thing about this nighttime work is not only that physical side, but the substance of what they were doing, the temporal substance of what they were doing in their jobs, because their role was to enter other people's time, the customer's time. And in this case, the customers were in the US or the UK. So for instance, they had to do extensive training on American culture. They took classes, sometimes for months, on what American culture is like. And this is on minutia. So like the temporality of the language, what the pacing is it fast or slow, how people say their words, what time means in those other places, how Americans use their time, do they live fast or do they live slow? And they have to talk and perform and live in that moment. They have to say good morning in the night, as my title of my talk says. In what I have called a process of national identity management, they have to do a reterritorialization of time. And there are many psychological consequences of doing that, of like living in one world virtually during your job and then going home and living in another world. And they described things like multiple personality disorders and a variety of other kinds of psychic fallout. And this does happen in many other countries aside from India. I have a book with a colleague, Kiran Mirkandani, which collects cases from many other countries around the world. So this is not just an Indian phenomenon. Something that's also notable about this workforce, it is about 5 million people who are, in doing this outsourced work, but it also extends to what's called the indirect workforce, which is all the people who enable the, outsourced workers to function in their jobs, to get to their jobs. So here's a picture of construction workers in one of the buildings that I was at when they were, building up higher. So they have to work at night. And the buildings are heavily surveilled and controlled for security reasons because of the information is so valuable. So they have to hire a lot of security guards. There's a lot of checkpoints you have to go to get inside these buildings. So all these kinds of workers, these, construction workers, security workers, shuttle drivers, all of these are, examples of indirect workers who are in estimates totaling, 2 to 3 times as many as the actual outsourced workers themselves. And a lot of them are coming from other parts of the country. They're migrant workers. So that's another layer of marginalization in this work. So I just want to end with a little phrase that Saskia Sassen mentioned in her wonderful keynote for this event, which was that the city sometimes talks back. And I think there are many cases of that in India that you can see that are really notable, especially for nighttime work and temporal kinds of hegemonic relations. So one of them that I've been writing about recently is a what's called the first virtual strike that happened in India in 1908 in colonial times. And this was the early form of ICT workers. These were telegraph workers. And in this map, you can see the different points, the different cities that these workers were in, that they connected a network that sustained the British Empire through this South Asian region. And at the point when the British wanted to switch to Greenwich Mean Time, this had a significant impact on, doubling their workload. And for this and other reasons, they staged a strike, and many strikes actually, and shut down the entire network, basically disabling the economic trade of the empire. And there are, so recent versions of this as well, which happened. This one happened in 2020, which was the world's largest labor strike of 250 million workers. This was a multi-sector strike of bankers and farmers and all kinds of folks, and it included some IT workers as well. And one of the issues that they are particularly concerned about are issues of time and control over time. Women, for instance, are not allowed to work at night, and this is now recently being addressed by the government. That is in certain industries. And when I talk to the workers about call center workers, for instance, about what their concerns are about the labor, a lot of them are about time. So, for instance, about forced overtime. So even if they're doing all this work at night, they still are asked to stay longer, without their control. So I think these sort of moments of workers taking to the streets, of these global cities and showing their strength are hopefully a little bit of a inspiration or a positive moment for the future. I haven't talked about sort of recent events during COVID, and I noticed many of the panelists have done this in other sessions. So if during the Q&A you want to talk about what's happening recently, I'm happy to address that too. And here's my email address and my website, which has the written version of this talk and also some other pieces as well. And I welcome any comments and questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Winifred. That was such a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. It really speaks to the value of looking to the global south as well and thinking about the context and the relationship with the global north. I was really struck by the way you're highlighting of the kind of disconnectedness of workers from their families and their locality and their ability to perform those kind of basic functions that we need to maintain healthy, happy lives. And the sort of, the reterritorializing of time and just the value of this kind of multi-scalar thinking that attends the overlapping of scales when we're thinking about the sort of connectedness of the global political economy, particularly in the time of sort of digital communications. That's wonderful. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Nick Dunn. Nick is the Executive Director of Imagination, the Design and Architecture Research Lab at Lancaster University, where he's also Professor of Urban Design. He's a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Social Futures and the founding director of the Dark Design Lab, which explores the impacts of nocturnal activity on humans and non-humans. Nick is the author of Dark Matters, a manifesto for the nocturnal city, which was published by Zero in 2016. And he's the co-editor of Rethinking Darkness, Cultures, Histories and Practices, which was published by Routledge last year. Over to you, Nick.
Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Lo, for the introduction. And thanks to the conference organisers for the opportunity to present today. I'm mindful of time, so hopefully should get through this in good course. Today, I'm going to be talking about urban nightscapes and some of the changes that have been occurring through and within them, not least in relation to the coronavirus pandemic. But before we get there, this image here was taken during the blackout in Manhattan following Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And although that's only less than a decade ago, the degree to which a major global city such as New York was augmented in the way urban environments are now, through various platforms, new technologies and business models, was nowhere near as pronounced. So at this point, for a city so used to being a glowing metropolis at night, pulsing with light, to be suddenly plunged into a situation with very little artificial light was highly unusual, and it led to citizens adopting altered mobilities when public transport was not accessible, and a high degree of ambiguity in how the city appeared, who was performing in it during these hours, and why was notable. For a short period, the city was reclaimed in novel and often convivial ways. An important shift in perception occurred about the dark, but it was temporal, of course. However, the flip side, we also recognise that it's within the frame of night that considerable work is increasingly done, often out of sight of mainstream society, sometimes illegally, typically poorly paid, and frequently precarious. How might we rethink our cities at night? When we consider how cities are augmented, we don't necessarily think about how light and dark are contested, and in some instances further sharpen existing inequalities. For example, this very large 120 square metre advertising screen blocked out daylight to poverty-hit families in a London apartment block for nearly 3 years. It's since been taken down after campaigners called for its removal. But while in situ, residents were unable to see daylight in the same way out of their windows and described feeling isolated and blocked out of everything by the advertisement, which was put up by their consent. By contrast, the over-illumination of poorer parts of the city, in particular social housing developments, is notable compared to the level of darkness measured in more affluent neighbourhoods. But artificial light at night, it's often been shown to indicate labour. It is important to recognise and also remember that the distribution of these lighting technologies is intertwined with issues of inequality in some cities, where the brightly lit commercial areas contrast with the dark neighbourhoods of the usually less affluent, if not even the poorer neighbourhoods, in which darkness can quickly become a symbol and a determinant of urban differentiation. But this situation is complex and contradictory, because an alternative use of light, as you can see here, is opposite in its application. Rather than being relatively absent, it is conspicuous by its overabundance. Lighting in social housing projects aims for maximum visibility for better CCTV surveillance, to minimise what's understood as will be antisocial behaviour and to try and deter crime. Only more affluent neighbourhoods have access to darkness. So this example here from some of London's social housing estates are immediately recognisable by their bright, cold light from tall masts. And yet the night, especially the urban night, has long been associated with pleasure, transgression and freedom. And of course, this can take many forms, but may frequently be a form of pleasure seeking. The expectation of pleasure is often a counterpoint to daytime activities, which are generally understood as relating to everyday worlds of work, education and care, as we've been hearing from our other speakers in this session. But we also know that everyday activities such as convenience shopping or going to the gym have gradually expanded into the early morning or late into the evening. So scenes such as this one here, which almost resembles a Renaissance painting. I mean, this was from 5 years ago, but perhaps now seems weirdly distant from us as the coronavirus pandemic has physically manifested itself in different ways through forms of lockdown, restriction, and curfew. Until recently, the need and desire to manage and control the urban night led to a distinct spatialization of its economy and often its workers, driven by practices of consumption. But in response to the culture of convenience in contemporary lifestyles, particularly lots of people now locked down and locked in, platforms have continued to emerge that expand consumption possibilities at night and put people increasingly able to ask for services that other people, of course, have to provide and work for at night. Notions of work and workplace have changed, and eating out has become more commonplace. Shifts which typically conceal the respective conditions of labour and often the economic status of those supporting such activities and services. For the night and time frame of darkness is also an assemblage of uneven economic, political and social geographies, since it belies a working population that reflects to varying degrees their ethnicity, immigration status, race, and limited and or precarious labour opportunities as determined by specific context. Now, this image was taken by me during the second national lockdown here in the UK, and it shows a security guard, one of only 5 people I encountered during 6 hours in the city centre at night. The others were a single street cleaner and 3 young women returning home from working at a hospital that night. It was also notable for the amount of wasted artificial light in the city. Cities themselves are dynamic entities of material and immaterial flows, processes, and systems. Manchester, like many places around the globe, is also a city of disappearances, certainly in terms of its nightscapes and nocturnal ambiances. The view shown here, taken just over 7 years ago, no longer exists, not because the buildings have changed, but this is because since early 2014, the City Council announced its intention to roll out replacement of 56,000 lamps with LEDs and have slowly begun replacing their sodium streetlights. It's important to state that this loss is not absolute, but direct experience of the current variety of darknesses is likely to be obstructed or at least hindered by the profusion of LED street lighting. It's also important to emphasise that this installation, maintenance and repair, the labour that does this work, is often conducted after dark and increasingly is moving to a gig economy situation. But it will also is unlikely to produce a coherent landscape at night. And that's because the planned power of completeness is an illusion, since the lighting technology is built over and responds to a longer history of partial infrastructures and contextual characteristics that shape its effects. So I've been doing a few things in relation to this since this shift started in Manchester. First, in order to capture some of the different ambiances and presences of darkness in Manchester at present, and then how they've been transforming, it's led to many hundreds of hours of night walking through nightscapes and the production of an archive of photographs, maps, and autoethnographic notes. And you can see here how much brighter the city generally appears from this image taken during the second lockdown. Also, the second thing I was doing pre-pandemic was working with groups of people on collective night walks around the Greater Manchester City region to share with them different places after dark so they can gain first-hand encounters of how the quality and the quantity of lighting in these places mediate experiences of the built environment. But thirdly, and I think of most relevance today, during the pandemic, I have been learning how other people make sense and use the nocturnal city in ways that support what they are doing, whether that's through labour, respite, or other activities. In relation to the latter point, during the third lockdown in particular, I've been speaking, physically distanced, of course, with a number of cooks, bicycle couriers, drivers, and other service providers in the Cheetham Hill area of the city. Now, for those of you not familiar with this area, it's an inner city district and it's home to a wonderful, vibrant, multi-ethnic community, which is the result of several waves of immigration to Britain. In the mid-19th century, it drew Irish people fleeing the Great Famine. Jews settled into the area in the late 19th and particularly early 20th centuries as they fled persecution in continental Europe. And then during the 1950s and 1960s, migrants from the Indian subcontinent and Caribbean established new communities in Cheetham Hill. More recently, it's become home for people from Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Far East. In many ways, it's immigration policy as urban landscape, and it perhaps comes as no surprise that a higher than average proportion of the population here work at night. And many of the bodies that are doing that labour in low-paid and or precarious forms of labour are bodies of colour. And I learned, for example, that a number of bike couriers use spaces close to this derelict church as sites of respite and recuperation, when normally outside of lockdown, it would be hazardous to do so due to the presence of young people partaking in underage drinking and drug taking. Of course, not everyone out and about is working in the same way, and there still endures surreptitious forms of pleasure seeking. There have been a number of illegal raves, pop-up bars and parties occurring across the night, which still require those working in the gig economy, either Uber drivers, private hire, to take people to these gatherings. So this, with a gathering of more than 40 people occurred in a building very similar to this one, just around the corner from this site, on the 16th of January, was broken up by police. Access to such sites of consumption during lockdown is still largely shaped by respective conditions of labour and socioeconomic status. So to conclude then, the work I've done during the pandemic, especially the encounters with those working at and through the night during 3 lockdowns, has been critical in helping me understand further the way our cities are augmented by services, the specific geographies they utilise, and also the impact it has on those bodies undertaking such labour. To rethink and reclaim the city after dark, for those who need it most, I suggest we need to establish nocturnal design values as a way of turning our attention to those elements that are often underrepresented or excluded from urban design. Understanding how nightscapes are used by a broad spectrum of people, particularly a diverse body of people, is critical to shaping how they may evolve. This is of particular importance if we are to develop wider and deeper knowledges of the situated, relational, and practice nature of the city after dark, and be able to rethink and reclaim it as a time and place that tries to address accessibility and equity. Thank you very much. If you want to get in touch, my Instagram's there, my email's always on there, but I'm going to stop sharing now so we can dive into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nick, for this really interesting insight in the reality of night shifts and the recently transformed situation due to the coronavirus restrictions. I personally really like the reference to night lightning being linked to night shifts, and therefore also we could say results in light pollution perhaps. So that was very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience? Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat.
I'd like to invite our other speakers to turn their cameras on as well. Thank you.
Okay, then I will start with the first question. We have heard yesterday in the panel too how massively lack of sleep affects health, and also Winifred mentioned the illness of workers in her talk due to lack of sleep. Is that something that was a topic also in the research of the others? So have interviewees, for example, noticed changes in their sleep patterns as a result of being forced to be constantly online on their smartphones or screens in order to get more gigs day and night?
I'm happy to speak. Certainly in some of the people I interviewed, it's having a very profound and actually very serious effect on their health. One of the situations that's shifted and quite awkwardly so, I suppose, in some ways, is there have been an increase in people entering the gig economy for a number of reasons, particularly in the city and around the UK. Sometimes it's because they've been made unemployed through their previous jobs due to the pandemic. Sometimes it's because they're on furlough. So there's a government scheme here where they're being paid to essentially stay at home because they can't necessarily access the work. And so they get a certain degree of the salary. So they're seeing the gig economy as a way to get additional money and almost a form of pleasure seeking and risk. It's something very different from what they would do in their daytime. But it's also broadened out. So certainly in the first lockdown, there were far more male bodies, and particularly in the Cheetham Hill area, male bodies of colour that were doing this labour at night. That has shifted quite noticeably through the second lockdown, and particularly this recent lockdown to accommodate different types of people doing that work. But you know, and I think when you have such a fragmented life in the way that Valentin was explaining some of the workers that Uber drivers do, that's very different than when you can do this for a night or a few nights a week and then not have to do this or just relax. You know, when it's the main thing that's providing shelter or paying the bills or enabling you to look after families, whether they're distant or under the same roof, I think that's a very different set of pressures and conditions than people that are doing it as a form of thrill seeking. And I was quite surprised how many people I spoke to. But we should also remember I'm a white male body walking through space at night. And so the people that want to speak to me and are happy to speak to me do get filtered through that process, whether I like it or not. And that's the reality of it, you know. So.
Would anyone else like to respond? No. I've Oh, sorry.
Oh,
please go.
I can just add that obviously, like quite a lot of people that we talked to did this for a couple of years full time, and then they just like really had to leave it because they didn't talk too much about health, but they talked about sort of a burnout close situation. So yeah, it was really a health hazard. And I also think it's important what Nick just said, that like a strategy of these companies is that the workforce is heterogeneous. So as you can technically you can technically use it for 5 hours a week, that's possible. But that's specific people that do this. And then other people get into this also thinking it's sort of a side job, and then it becomes actually more than a full-time. Sometimes it's like 60, 70. We were like, it was pretty crazy to ask the workers how many hours are you working per week. And as I said, often they couldn't say it, but sometimes like the numbers that they said were just insane. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions come in for Winifred. So the first one, I'm just going to read it out. You'll be able to see it in the chat as well if that suits you better. Numerous BPOs like Teleperformance, Accenture, HCL Technologies are expanding globally. What tensions are there to keep, in inverted commas, jobs in India versus distributing them across more time zones?
Yeah, great question. Globalization is one of the features of this industry. And although it did primarily start in India, and India was the leader for quite some time, the Philippines actually has taken over and is now equal, if not more. They have the same amount of contracts now from the US and the UK. You definitely do see these, going down to the least common denominator of price, I would say. I would say that the cost of labor is their main concern rather than time zone. The interesting thing about this whole industry, which I didn't mention before, is that it's all set up along these post-colonial dyadic relations. They can't just go anywhere like with manufacturing. With manufacturing, you can just pick up and go to the cheapest workforce in any country, which is why a lot of them end up in Southeast Asia, for instance, and other parts of South Asia like Bangladesh. With voice work, it is linguistic based. And so the sending countries are bound to go to countries that have workers who can speak to their consumers. And that is all based on colonial relations. So that's why UK is going to India, why Spain is going to Latin America, why the French are going to parts of Africa. And so they don't have quite the full footloose capabilities as one might think. But the industry is also globalizing in other ways. So Indian companies actually are now picking up the outsourcers and going around the world to different locations themselves. There are Indian outsourcers in Mexico now, parts of Central America, who are spearheading their own processes. And there's also multilingual call centers that take multiple languages. So it is a concern for India because their contracts are being reduced. And I think that's a reason why we have the development of this huge fake call center industry now, which I was, going to ask if we were in the same location of people who would raise their hands if they received a scam phone call. But it's a huge industry now of these call centers popping up in India who are selling fake things for things like Microsoft or pretending to be the FBI or the IRS or government officials or whatever. So, there are many implications for the globalization of this process. And I'll just take the second question here, which was about, is it a specific group who's doing it? Yes, I didn't get to mention that, but absolutely. I mean, the only people who can handle like staying up all night and completely upending their whole lives are usually young people. So it's a very young workforce. And at nighttime, it's mostly male for a number of reasons. One being that there have been laws against, women working at night in India, as I mentioned, which, the outsourcing industry gets an exemption from that. But there's kind of holdover practices of keeping women out of that. And also it's paid more. The nighttime global industry is paid more than the daytime call center industry. So the daytime call center industry is 90% women, but the nighttime call center industry is much less. But these jobs, people don't last in them very long. And bringing back to Laura's point, the accumulated effects of lack of sleep and on your body, people can only do it for 6 months to a year and a half. That's what I found among my workers. They just can't take it on a sustained basis.
Thank you. Really interesting. We've got a question from Sarah for Nick, but I also wonder if there's kind of relevance to all of our speakers. She asks, can you say something more about the idea of the city of disappearances? It's a very thought-provoking idea. And I wonder if this speaks to questions of disappearance, but also questions of visibility and invisibility for the other panelists as well, perhaps. So, Nick, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm not sure I'll live up to how thought-provoking it is, but I'll do my best. I mean, when I'm talking about it today, I'm talking very specifically about how the qualities, the atmospheres, and the tones of the night in an urban environment are shifting through a quite aggressive introduction of white-blue LED technologies. And this isn't just about the poetics of urban nightscapes, because that exposure to that white-blue LED lighting, particularly for people working night shifts, doing on-call work and other forms of labour who have exposure, even streetlights, it has profound and quite serious health consequences in terms of non-communicable diseases, particularly actually more so for women rather than men, but still very bad for men when they're doing this shift work. So what I've been trying to do is record how my home city is physically changing, albeit temporarily, through the introduction, because lots of cities have run out, and the general argument for LEDs is one about cost in terms of economic savings, but not thinking about the costs of human health, the impact on other species, of course, which get very disrupted, urban nature systems, ecosystems, biodiversity loss. So it's to do more with the loss of night, I think I'm talking about it, but I'm sure our other speakers will have different and fascinating perspectives on it.
Do any speakers have any, even not necessarily in the context of light, but I suppose we could think about disappearance, who appears, who doesn't appear, what kind of bodies, whose work, whose labour. For example, Winifred, I was really interested in the images that you took of the people who are working on the building site who wouldn't be readily visible, right, in so many settings, but particularly to you as a researcher, had you not been kind of walking around that area, that wouldn't have appeared within your radar to think about domestic labour and thinking how is potentially less visible within the context of the city than an Uber driver, perhaps. And I was wondering if you have any reflections on these.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I mean, I had that in my notes to mention, but I didn't want to take too much time. I actually have co-edited a book with my colleagues called Invisible Labor, and it's just about this. I think Saskia Sassen also mentioned this in her keynote talk about the invisibility of labor that goes on at nighttime specifically. And there's a lot of service level work, like janitorial work, right, where people are coming in at nighttime to clean up and maintain the infrastructure of the daytime workers who nobody ever sees. So I think that's, and these construction workers, again, are in that category. And I would say another related category to this is not only visible work, but secret work, which was so fascinating in Saskia's talk about all the labor of shredding or whatever secret documents that all happens at nighttime. So, yeah, I mean, I was really interested in that in Nick's talk too, what are the kinds of labor that we don't see because they happen by design at nighttime.
Valentin and Barbara, do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute, or we can move on to another question?
Maybe just, the question is also what invisibilizes this type of work, right? I find all of your points really interesting. And Nick, what you just said, this is a bit of a random comment, but it just made me think in feminist geography, there is all this research on spaces of fear, right? So who can walk around at night and who benefits from LED lighting and who doesn't. And so once you have, LED lights, and maybe some people feel safer, but then other people feel less safe. And so that's one just thought that I have. But I think you've made so many interesting comments that I kind of have my head is going in 5 different directions. So I'll just...
Can I have something on that too? Because I had that thought exactly, Barbara. And one of the things I was thinking of is, I have a colleague, Joe Heyman, and he writes about the borderland next to the U.S. border. And there are very low-income populations who live that are, Chicano, Mexican origin folks who live right on that border. And the part of the infrastructure of the border is floodlights. They have huge floodlights that are, designed just to watch those communities. And so it really made me think of that. When is nighttime light surveillance of marginalized groups, and when is it capacity building? So yeah, thanks, Barbara, for raising that.
I just saw that Valentin has a question to Winifred. Is that already answered, or?
No. It's just a quick question because we're talking about platformization. I found it so interesting that the work is so visible that you described in a sense, at least in a sense of you have traffic jams, you see them going to offices, their actual spaces. That's not happening usually. In platform work, it's a bit different, especially in remote platform work where people really are at home. And I was wondering, because I feel this outsourcing development has been going on for quite a while, but it seems that call center work is somewhat resists this development towards platformization. Or maybe I'm wrong, but I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about if that's happening or not.
Yeah. That's something that I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to mention it. So in my book, Invisible Labor, I have a chapter just on this, and there have been 2 different strategies that have sort of been pursued by the call center industry in general. I'd say for maybe a decade, so before the pandemic even. One, which is to try to crowdsource this work, and the other, which is to try to automate this work. And both of the things are happening, and it really accelerated during the pandemic. So crowdsourcing the work works really well in the global north, where you can have affordable technical equipment. You have to have a phone, right? You have to have a computer, and all in your own cost. And you have to have internet that's relatively affordable too, right? For these middle income workers or low income workers. In the global south, it's less viable because the internet companies, they gouge the rate. The rates are just so high for internet, much more than compared to the global north. And while a lot of people have smartphones, the what do you call it? The reliability is still not there that would make it, basically effective to do, to send it to homes. But I think even a bigger push against that, which maybe you're thinking about, is that call center workers are dealing with a lot of sensitive financial information. Like a good portion of what their work is about is in finance. It's credit cards, it's debt collection, it's sales, things involving money. And there are already so many problems with data breaches. And the call center industry is very scared about that information getting out. So I actually do see a pushback against home-based work and crowdsourcing in general in the call center industry. Now, automation is the other side. And this has been happening in a whole bunch of super weird ways, which, I'm happy to lay out. But, they're trying to use chatbots. They're trying to use, text-based interfaces. And so for certain things, you can do that. But for other things, you can't. You need a human to do them. And so, maybe eventually we'll see a decline in this work, but it hasn't happened yet in India. So, and the only thing that actually declines the work are recessions. When U.S. Companies, pull back their contracts. So, yeah, that's my sort of take on it.
Thank you very much, Winifred. I think we have time for one last question, and it goes to Barbara from Sarah from our NITE team. Can you say something more about the impact of this care work on workers' families and private life, and night workers in general? Who cares for the kids left behind, for example?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So as I said, I'm still in the middle of my field work, and I've actually not come across a worker yet that has small children. And I think that might also speak for itself. As I said early on, who does this kind of work actually exclude, right? And so often the people you see on care platforms are elderly, but not elderly, but people who are older, so beyond having small children, like women in their 50s and 60s, or very young women, so students, people under the age of 25. And yeah, I think there's also a long history of that. The UK, for example, used to have these au pair visas that explicitly prohibited people from being married and having children. So you could only get this if you were a single woman under the age of 25, I think. It doesn't exist anymore, but just to illustrate that. I don't actually know. And I will keep you updated in case I find people who manage to combine this kind of work with their own childcare for their own children.
Thanks, really interesting.
Thanks so much. I think it's time, sadly, to bring this to a close. An enormous thank you to our speakers for a fascinating set of talks. I really enjoyed them, and we'll be thinking those over for the next few days at least. And it's going to really help us all move forward in our work, I'm sure. We're going to move on to the conference closing now. Thank you so much to the attendees who've come to this session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'll pass over now to Manuela and Laura-Solmaz.
So as Lo already said, now we come to an end of this amazing conference. I would like to say a big thank you to our student assistants, Felix Busch-Gertzma, Jola Züch, Selma Krug and Ren Mino, who have been taking care of the technical support and the registration. And without their hard work and constant presence during this conference, this event would not have been possible at all. So thank you very much, for this has been a great help. And I would also like to thank my colleague Manuela Boyagiev, who has been, together with myself, the host here in Berlin, and who's the head of the German part of the NITE project. And I would also like to thank the great moderation of the different panels from our NITE team. So thank you so much, Alva, Lo, Katie, Ben, Derek, Sarah, and Manuela again. This has been great. And of course, a special thanks to our wonderful speakers from a wide range of disciplines. We were so lucky to hear perspectives from astronomy, chronobiology, geography, urban studies, social science, anthropology, nightlife, and many more. It was a truly transdisciplinary event with exciting discussions. And last but not least, I would like to thank you as the audience. Thank you so much for your participation. Without your great questions and interest, the discussions would not have been so lively. And now I would love to pass on to my colleague Manuela.
Thank you, Laura. So the only person who has not been thanked for is you. And I'd like to extend all my thank yous to all of you who you just mentioned, Laura, but particularly yourself, because you have done a tremendous work of putting this conference together, of making it a research event and bringing it to such a beautiful end. Thank you so much. For everyone who's interested in the follow-up of this, I would like to also mention that we are planning a big conference to end and present our work in this project in Leiden in 2022, so 1 year from now in April and May. And we hope to continue with many of you working on these very different topics that have been raised today, pulling them together and encouraging even more interdisciplinary talk, because our sense is, of course, that the NITE can only be investigated from very, very different angles and with very different knowledges. It's been a very great pleasure to see a lot of you who have been friends for many years, and I'd like to thank so much, particularly our research consortium and the great opportunity to work with you all. So we very much look forward to seeing you next year. Please check out our project website to see when the date will be, and we'll keep you all posted. And have a very beautiful weekend. Get some very nice nights without work, and I'll see you all around. Thank you very much for being here.